So the Eastern Woodlands people, they lived east of the Mississippi River. There were a large number of these groups. They hunted deer for the most part as their primary food source. They also hunted bear. They gathered edible plants, seeds, and nuts. Around 4000 BCE, we start seeing gourds and clay pottery emerge from these areas. Uh, After that, indicated agriculture, and so they cultivated crops like sunflowers and tobacco. And corn, though, was the most important crop by far for these people. Most of them lived in semi permanent structures. For example, this Choctaw housing here, which would have been representative of natives in the southeast, or this English drawing of Powhatan village. So those would have been the natives that lived over here on the coast of the Chesapeake Bay. The most powerful grouping of the eastern seaboard tribes, the Iroquois mostly lived in what's now Pennsylvania and New York, and they their culture is marked by this use of the longhouse as their dwelling. A longhouse could be up to 100 to 150 feet long. Several families would live in one. Usually the matriarch, the mother or grandmother, was kind of in charge of the particular longhouse of a family. So the Iroquois were quite successful in several ways. One was their successful cultivation of corn, which allowed them to become more settled. So a longhouse is going to stay in one place. So the Iroquois moved less often than people in the southeast or closer to the coast. By the 16th century, about 100 years prior to regular European contact, the Iroquois formed what was called the Great League of Peace, or the League of Five Nations. And that included the Seneca, the Onondaga, the Mohawk, Oneida, and Cayuga tribes, these five nations here. This is a picture of a mohawk. That's where we get the name for the distinctive hairstyles that were called mohawks. You used to see them in the 80s. So the Mohawks were particularly fearsome warriors, and European observers would document the Mohawks' methods of fortification that you can see here in this 17th century engraving. So the Iroquois League of Five Nations was kind of a military alliance, and they were very dominant in what's now the areas of upstate New York and Pennsylvania, and even up into New England and further south into what's now Maryland or Virginia. The Iroquois were feared by other Native American tribes because they were so militarily powerful. And Europeans worked with them for a long time because the Iroquois had such a strong hold over their territory. It was difficult to dislodge them from one of these forts. The Mid-Atlantic, or area around Virginia and Maryland, where the English colonists first arrived, that area was inhabited by Algonquian Indians. So Algonquians, this refers to another language grouping of many different kinds of tribes. So, for example, Algonquian groups tended to live on the coast of the eastern seaboard. The Powhatans were Algonquians, the Montauks, the Pequots, the Narragansetts, the Wampanoags. All these were Algonquian language groupings. Also, up here in Canada, you had the Algonquian language grouping dominant. The Iroquois language groupings were in the southern part of the Great Lakes region. So the Algonquians lived along the coastlines. They were known for also growing corn, but they hunted and fished a little bit more than the Iroquois did, and their settlements were semi-permanent. The Algonquian groups lived in what were called wigwams, housing that looked something like this. You had a dome-like shell covered with tree bark or deer skins. And these were actually very convenient housing units for Algonquian Indians because you could strike one of these villages made up of wigwams in about half a day and then move your entire village quite quickly. Lived along the coastlines during part of the year, the milder areas where it was milder climate during the winter, and then moved to better hunting grounds in the summer. So they moved 2 or 3 times a year. The Native American farming method was actually quite successful. So historians have called the method of Native American farming the complex. The complex is made up of 3 crops: corn, beans, and squash. The Native Americans grew all of it together. You planted your corn stalks, and around the base of the corn stalk, you planted beans and squash. And the plants worked together symbiotically. The beans would wrap around the corn stalk, and the squash would grow at the base of the corn stalk, and the nitrates, the squash would infuse the corn, and so you'd get better corn, and you'd get better squash as a result of this method of planting the complex together. So it was very nutritional food that was produced out of this method. It worked very well for the natives. Natives did modify corn. They took wild corn that grew in North America that looked something like this, and over the years modified it. Not quite this large. This is a modern ear of corn, but they genetically modified over years by breeding ears of corn that were much bigger and produced a lot more yield. So the Indians modified their environment to quite a bit. They also modified the environment around their villages. They would clear areas to plant crops in the complex. As you can see, this Theodore DeBry English engraving illustrates Powhatan Village. You can also see this activity that the Powhatan Indians engaged in involved a lot of clearing of land. Here they're clearing out trees in order to plant crops and use the trees as canoes and make them into boats for their naval forces. Some Indian tribes had fleets of river-based warriors that traveled by canoe and kayak. So the Indians would burn down trees, burn down large portions of forest. They would engage in controlled burns that would remove the undergrowth from forests. That would make it easier to plant crops and would also expose the small game that they hunted. So given the technology they had access to, the Indians did modify their environment quite a bit. They don't fit that stereotype of being one with the land that we think of. Just because they didn't have as much advanced technology as Europeans didn't mean they also didn't want to modify their environment. Had they had the technology of Europeans, the Indians probably would have done their best to modify their environments as much as they could. So this idea that the Indians always use their environment sustainably is a fiction. That's one reason they had to move fairly often. Sometimes they would use up their resources in one area and have to move on. So we want to remember that native societies were dynamic societies, and they used and modified their environment quite a bit, and built up villages that conformed to their culture.